This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Kathryn, Robert, and I are going to address a listener question, or at least do some spinning off, because the question's about dialogue. And we've got some episodes on dialogue. So we will be linking to those in the show notes to make sure Angela gets this question answered. She asked, how do you energize a section of fiction text that is extended dialogue, like one character teaching something to another character for a number of pages? How do you add details that keep the reader visually engaged in seeing the characters and the space while just reading their dialogue? So, great question, Angela. Thank you so much for sending in a question. Kathryn, I know you had some thoughts when you read this. I'm gonna throw it over to you.
You're throwing me under the bus here. No, I'm just kidding.
No, because you were on the ball.
I have read some examples of dialogue text in which the author just continues to have paragraph upon paragraph upon paragraph upon paragraph of extended dialogue with no tags, no description, no action. And to be quite honest, it's boring and I hate it. Uh-huh. And it's something that especially happens, I've noticed a lot in books where there's where she talks about teaching, mentor-mentee situations, that kind of montage type thing where you're explaining the world or magic or how to be a warrior or what is going on in this next, part of the book that you must understand as the reader. And I think extended pages of dialogue are kind of like a crutch that you don't use. And also it can be very, very, very hard on your reader to slog through it. So my short answer is don't do it.
Right. Yes, do not try to plant an instruction manual or guidebook in the middle of your narrative.
Yeah, and I mean, that said, there are times when you want a character to be, let's say, someone who makes dramatic speeches or speaks forever and ever and ever. That's something where you want to use that beautiful narrative exposition tool.
Yes.
Give us the first couple sentences, give us a break, and then work that information in some other way. But you can still have your character be so bored by the teaching that took forever, 8 hours, or whatever.
Yes.
So we get the idea that the mentor is giving huge long explanations, but we as the reader don't have to read it.
Right. And if you're trying to teach the reader by extension of teaching your character, you're just stop. You're going about it the wrong way. The reader needs to learn about the world, the magic, the fight, the whatever, as things unfold as part of your story. So never info dump, and don't think you can disguise an info dump as dialogue. You can't. It doesn't matter. Putting quotes around it doesn't help it.
Yeah, I think also there's, again, I know we often talk about this, but there's sort of that, how many passes you're going through. And, I'd be worried if that was a final version, as Kathryn says. I do tend to write dialogue heavy in first draft. And in fact, in my sort of early days authoring, I would give copies to beta readers. And I think it might have been the second book I wrote where I was trying to be more action and snappy, and it was flowing really well.
Yeah.
I got feedback that, oh, wow, but there's a lot of talk, isn't there, in this book? So I went back and looked at it and think, yeah, okay, so I've done exactly that. I've gone, 6 pages where it wasn't, no one said it was exposition heavy. It was just too much dialogue.
Right.
And if you come back to, I've talked a little bit about neuro-linguistic programming principles. One of the things that human beings we track difference is how we go through the world. We're programmed to perceive difference. So when we get long periods of sameness, we kind of blank out.
Right.
So any steady state is not good. So, if you're in a long train ride and nothing happens, or if you go into a tunnel and it's a long tunnel, all of a sudden there's like, okay, when are we going to get to the end? When are we going to get to the end? So I think it's the same with long periods of dialogue. No matter how snappy it is, at some point it becomes the same state. And so, Kathryn's hinted at it. You got to break it up. But I find that I'm sometimes doing that in revision. I get into a flow state. These characters are hammering away at each other. Maybe they're having an argument, or maybe and you think, this is really good. I'm not going to stop and say, let's turn and look at the castle walls and how they were built. It's just it's just going to take me out of draft mode. But I think that is something, when you come back to it, you've got to sort of put yourself back in reader mode, and maybe that's putting it on a device and reading it as a reader, and okay, how am I immersing myself in this story now? Am I just hearing the characters? Is there anything I can see in this scene? Is there anything I can smell or taste in this scene? And so sort of looking for that immersion. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think having a device or a friend who's never seen the pages before read it to you is really helpful, because then you can't emote for your characters. You can't put pauses and inflection in where you hear it in your own head. Somebody who's just getting the words on the page, or a machine, is going to read it to you much differently than you would read it to yourself. And just listen, notice if you start zoning out or start wondering about questions, because we tend to perform for ourselves the movie that's playing in our heads, and that doesn't necessarily make it onto the page, So what you see isn't what the reader experiences. And I like what you were saying, Robert, about the other sensory details. What can I pull in besides just the dialogue? And I think something everyone should do is go watch your favorite, Kung Fu apprentice movie, like Kung Fu Panda, because they always have the montage where the apprentice has to learn the skills, and they can do this in 2 minutes of time and minimal or no dialogue, because they can do a music and just show all this stuff that's happening and then go, what did I like? What did I notice? I saw the apprentice fall on his face. I saw him sweating and panting. I saw him carving up, trying really hard. I saw him disappointed and feeling defeatist, like he's never going to measure up. I saw the master shake his head like, oh, no, you didn't, right? And think about these gestures and these emotional moments that are conveyed without dialogue. What can you put into your story in that teaching scene that's going to bring the scene to life, that's going to get us away from the dialogue and communicate through body language, facial expressions, or subtext,
Well, I suppose also, exactly. If you think about it literally, dialogue is telling, not showing.
Yeah.
So, we really want to bring in some showing or some expression of what's going on. So those little hat tips to where are they? It's become dark as Sensei has led me through these last 5 exercises. The clouds have drawn in. It's just it just needs to be a few words, even just enough to keep that little. Here's the scene I'm still in.
Right, and don't forget the action. What is the character doing? Yeah. We're learning something. Don't make it from a textbook. Yeah. Make it something we have to physically do, so you can show the character, with the muscle strain or with the effort or whatever that thing is, embody the character. Let the reader experience the doing.
Yeah, the next morning I dressed with the deliberation that Sensei requested. Feeling the bruise in my, right bicep. Or, you don't need much, and then you can leap into this time Sensei launched into a diatribe, and then then you can have your dialogue heavy bit. I think it's when it's one-sided as well, it's tricky. Like if you've got, what a sense from Angela's question is, if you've got a long explanation required from a mentor, then that can be very tricky. And I like to do. in my early days, I did a lot of ping pong dialogue, or what you might call on the nose dialogue. So what do you think, Alida? Well, what I think is, and I when I learned more about misdirection and I think I've mentioned this before, I think Lee Child is very good at that in the Jack Reacher books. There's, they barely ever answer each other in the dialogue. It just kind of goes all over the place. And if you can if you can practice that, I think that's helpful. So, if the mentor is having a big, long, extended explanation, but suddenly is interrupted quite rudely by the other character who just, sidelines them with a completely left field thing that's related to what they're talking about, then that can help, I think, as well, as sort of break it up a bit, as opposed to okay, I've got to sit back here and take this lecture.
Right.
Yeah. The other thing to do in a lecture is let your character's mind wander because typically the reader doesn't need to know everything the character is being taught. So you can give us a few sentences of that speech and then just move into your narrative exposition and show us something either internal to your POV's mind or external to that scene. Show us the weather, show us the, the memory, show us whatever, go elsewhere. And it could be a very brief narrative bridge just to show that time passed, or you could go into a whole flashback scene if you're going into a memory, or whatever. But that's another way to avoid pages of instructive monologue. Right.
The other thing I think is a lot of times mentors or teachers don't want to give the whole picture at once. They're not going to, if you were teaching a class, Alida, you're not going to start with here's step 1 and here's step 12 all in one, 20-minute, blitz. You're going to ladle out information a little bit at a time, which also can lead to your character making horrendous mistakes, which is fantastic. So, your mentor could say something that at the time doesn't make a ton of sense, and you don't have to explain all of it because they're going to get to it later, or they think they're going to get to it later. And then, and that way your character only has bits of information, and so does your reader, and that makes it more intriguing as well.
Yeah. Yes. You want to dole it out, parcel it out over the course of the story. It's that process of unfolding, or as Andrew Stanton called it in that TED Talk, give them 2 + 2, don't give them 4. It's the magic of 2 + 2. One of the joys of reading is the process of figuring it out and engaging with that unfolding of story. So if you're front-loading too much information instead of unfolding it as the story progresses, you're spoon-feeding, you're giving the reader 4. And you might info dump, you might bore them, the reader drifts away, you might just, remove all the mystery and tension from your story. So,
Or you might have readers like me who just skip the entire thing and move on to where it's more exciting.
There's also, I was talking about steady states being boring as well. I'm also the other, not necessarily the opposite, but the other example of that is where if I'm reading a book and I don't see any dialogue tags for pages, I switch off. I really can't stand it because I don't like, even though it can be very descriptive, for me, I love it. I just love that dialogue interaction between characters. But then, as you say, Kathryn, pages and pages of just dialogue with no beats, no tags, no action, that's also boring as well. So it's definitely, for me anyway, it's a balance between the two. I mean, I know some people are different. It depends what genre you read as well. The other thing I was thinking about too is that you can go back and look at the dialogue that you've written and think about, is there a different way that could be expressed that is more visual, auditory, or kinesthetic? So an example might be, Sensei's talking. So when we use the sword, we must balance the weight in our hands. We must feel the sword. We must become one with the sword. And that's all very well. That's telling. But if we had him break and he leaned over, said, "Take this sword." He picks up the sword. He holds out one hand and he gets the sword and balances it on the blade on his palm. The sword doesn't move. You can do it with it's still showing what he means, but you're showing it as opposed to having him explain it.
Right.
So I think
Yes.
Sometimes, we get that it's a whole dialogue as exposition thing that it also has to be balanced. You need it, but overdone. So you can go back in editing and say, well, I have got pages and pages of dialogue here. Is that some of that dialogue that lends itself to being extracted from dialogue and put into beats or action?
Right. Yeah. And I think that's what I was getting at with the watch the training montage in a movie, because it's exactly what you're saying. Like, you can have Sensei tell the apprentice why he needs to hold the sword a certain way so it balances, or you can just show it. There it is. Mm-hmm. Wow. Awe-inspiring, right? Look at what that dude's doing with that sword.
Well, I just rewatched The Martian over the last couple of days. And it's an interesting story because, it's an action movie. There's not much character arc in there. And it's really it's a Robinson Crusoe story. I guess it's a castaway. It's a, marooned on an island story.
Yeah.
And there isn't an awful lot of conflict in it. He's basically just as he says, I'm going to have to science this out of this, and if you read the book, the enthusiast's interest in the book is in how the science is exacted. And that's where the intrigue comes. And there are a couple of moments in the book that are definitely life or death moments, but they don't only one of them is used in the movie. I had never realized how many montages there are in that movie. Only when I watched it the second time. It's unbelievable. They're all over the place. And clearly that's because there was a whole amount of science info dumping in the book that's interesting if you're reading it, but as a visual medium, it's terrible because, all we're going to get is Mark Watney reading into his diary. So I weighed the last 312 kilos of potatoes and divided it up into, no, what you need to do is have this quick thing of him getting the scales and doing this and going out to the kitchen and then eating another meal and kind of grimacing because he's eating potatoes again. So it was they're everywhere throughout. It's just amazing.
Yeah, we don't think about the shortcuts that we take until you go back and look for them.
Yes.
So both in books and in movies, like sometimes unless you're looking for them, you just don't realize that they're there. They're being used.
So are we then saying then, if I've written pages and pages of dialogue and it's one of those mentor or exposition type things, that I should go back, or a writer should go back and look at that and say, is that worth turning into a montage? Do we really need all that info, and can I let it drip out later in the story?
Yes, you absolutely should go back and assess it and change it, because if you've got pages and pages of dialogue and nothing else, you aren't writing a novel, you're writing a radio play, Yep. So that's not the form you're working with here. And the thing to remember about a movie montage is that we aren't expected to believe that each clip in that montage happened consecutively. No. We watch the montage in 2 minutes, but that could cover weeks or even months of training. So you've got this point of view character who's got to learn and grow and go through a lot of training. So you might have one chapter, but use, 3 or 4 episodes of training, keep them brief, keep them very visual, showing, physical, and use brief sections of narrative to bridge between each one so that we get the sense of the passing of time, we get the sense of our point of view characters' relationship to the training, how he's changing as he becomes more physically fit or less resentful of the sensei or whatever, whatever your scenario is, so that we have the effect of the montage while working within the form of the novel. And within those scenes, those clips of the training, the master can explain things, but we don't need all of it. Just give us those key things that the reader needs to understand in order to track the apprentice's journey.
I suppose we could go back to our favourite reference, the Harry Potter novels again. I mean, at the end of the day, it's 7 books of a kid going to school. It could be deadly boring because they're having to sit through learning about potions or learning about exotic creatures or learning about the dark arts. But there's no section in there where they sit there and listen to just Snape dictate a whole load of stuff, unless it's intended to be a boring lesson.
Right. Which brings up a really great point of every scene needs to be about more than one thing. So while Snape is lecturing about potions, we see that the students are learning about potions, but we also see that, what's his face, the blonde kid?
Malfoy.
Draco Malfoy is tormenting Hermione in the back row of the classroom, and Snape is turning a blind eye to it or something. So the emotional content of the scene is never about the lesson. You have to have more than one thing happening in your scene, and that's going to keep the instructional piece of it interesting. Right? So besides using the montage idea as a shortcut, we also need something else going on. It's the character's growth and skills. It's the character's relationship to the teacher. It's the students relating to each other. It's the friction between, the mudbloods and the purebloods or whatever. Whatever themes you're working with there. So don't lose sight of your themes.
And it could be even something as simple as, the dialogue has gone on for a long time and the student is now acutely aware that the lesson has gone half an hour longer than planned and that, a key date that they've set up that night is now going to be, fallen into disaster. So there can be all sorts of things going on that create tension and conflict.
Yes. Yeah. And don't forget, too, about the reader's reaction to things might be different than your point of view character's reaction. So when I think it was Rita Skeeter is making Harry write with the quill that draws his blood, that uses his blood for ink, right? Harry's grimacing and writing out the words and he's mad. But we have like 50 other thoughts going through our head, like, this is horrifying. Oh my God, can you imagine a quill that would do this? And what a horrible person. And so work with all of the elements you have in your story and the emotions and the subtext and your reader's reactions, and really think about what notes you can play or strings you can pull on all of those levels, not just the teacher is teaching the student, but what's their relationship? How does the reader feel about each of them? How does this play into my plot and advance the story? What is the subtext here? What thematic content am I building into the scene? That's going to keep it interesting.
Wow. There's a lot to do, isn't there?
Always. That's why writing is so much fun.
I've written 10 pages of dialogue. Now I'm going to go back and make it real.
Thank you for the question, Angela. Clearly we had a lot to say.
Yeah, that was great. And I hope we addressed the visual piece of it just by talking about what the characters are doing in the scenes and the worlds, because I don't think we explicitly said how to be visual, but I do think we addressed that throughout. Would you guys agree? Do you feel like we kind of covered that?
Yeah, I think it's what I call an answer on the same logical level. So someone says, how do I stop smoking? And you say, well, you stop buying cigarettes. And it's not really the question. The question is, what do I do about the cravings, and why am I smoking in the first place? What's it satisfying? So at a straightforward level, you could say, how do you add the details, which what Angela's asking? Well, you could put little beats in. They glance up to the ceiling. They have to stop for a cup of tea. All of those things are helpful. But I think what we've talked about is a broader aspect of, bring some drive, bring the emotion, think about where you're heading with the story, why are you having those dialogue pages. And, it might be that the very last thing you do is go back and, seed in some of the things, that they walk from one room to the other and one of the characters trips over and they have to stop for a while, or, just you can break it up. But that shouldn't be, in my view, that's not the first
Right.
That's not the first activity. You know, you first want to draw back and say, okay, what am I trying to achieve with the scene or scenes?
Yep, exactly.
Well said.
Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.